To begin the introduction for Rick Lowe, I just want to say that we actually, the Nasher Sculpture Center Education Department, I'm speaking as the educator here, learned a little bit about Rick in working on a program with the Edward and Betty Marcus Foundation for Digital Education. And one of the workshops that we worked on together with staff members from Project Row Houses, which Rick founded in 1995, was a digital storytelling of your institution. And one of the most interesting stories, of course, was about Project Row Houses. One of the things that they brought with them was footage of Rick speaking about Project Row Houses, and one of the things that he started to talk about, and I'm sure he'll mention today, is this idea of the social aspect of what sculpture can be. In other words, a community coming together through art. And it's really an amazing thing that they're doing there, and that he's been able to do on projects throughout the world. And that's one of the things we're trying to do with this series, is to have different definitions of what sculpture can be. And I think Rick has definitely done that for us. So, Rick Lowe resides in Houston. His formal training is in the visual arts. For over the past 20 years, he has worked both inside and outside the art world in institutions such as museums by participating in exhibitions, but also has developed many community art projects throughout the world as well, outside of those institutions. He has participated in exhibitions nationally, internationally in places such as the Phoenix Art Museum, Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, and the Indianapolis Museum of Art. I just got the year wrong, didn't I? It's 1993, isn't it, for Project Row Houses? Yes, I did. Okay. It's 1993 he founded Project Row Houses, which is an arts and cultural community located in a historically significant and culturally charged neighborhood in Houston, Texas. In 2006, he kind of, this idea of working with communities was continued where he spearheaded the Transforma projects in New Orleans, which was a collaborative effort to engage artists and creativity in the rebuilding of the city after Katrina. He has worked as a guest artist on a number of community projects, such as he worked on the arts plan for the Rem Koolhaas designed Seattle Public Library, worked with California-based artist Suzanne Lacey and curator Mary Jane Jacobs on the Burrow Project in South Carolina, was the lead artist on the Delray Beach Cultural Loop in Florida. And in 2005, he worked with British architect David Adjaye on a project for the Seattle Art Museum in their new Olympic Sculpture Park. He was a Lowe Fellow at Harvard University, the Graduate School of Design in 2001-2002. And in 2008, he worked with the students at Amherst College on a project called Exchange Value, which I know he's going to speak about today. He's a board member of the Manil Foundation, has served on the board of the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and has served as an artist in residence in universities throughout the United States. Of course, he lectures internationally, nationally, internationally, and that's why we're here today. So please help me in welcoming Rick Lowe.
Thank you, Stephen, for that great introduction. And thank you for coming out on this lovely Saturday afternoon to hear me speak about my work. Unfortunately, I have to apologize beforehand that I'm going to show you a lot of images, because in order for me to talk about my work, I kind of do it in a narrative way, and the images kind of just help the narrative move along. And I also have to apologize to the camera person back there who's documenting, because it wasn't my idea, it was the technician who told me, he said, this microphone, I can move around with it. So it's probably going to make the camera guy's job a little bit hard, because I might do that. Okay, so I am going to talk about three projects that I've been working on, and I'll mention one other, and we'll just go from there. I'm going to contextualize it, though, within the context of how I began as an artist. I started out mostly kind of as kind of an activist artist, I guess you might call it, doing work that dealt with political and social issues. And I would do these kind of projects both inside and outside of museums, dealing with issues from environmental issues, police brutality, all kinds of stuff like that. And it always put me in a position where there was some question about what I was doing in terms of its relation to art, even when I was doing this kind of work. As you can see, this is a review from the Houston Chronicle, where it was questioning whether artists like myself were making art or making points, if it was propaganda. And but one of the things that I noticed as I was doing this kind of work is I've always wanted to have some kind of immediate impact on low-income populations. And so and the reason I would work both inside and outside of traditional art institutions is because I wanted the immediacy of working outside and really being in touch with people. So what I started to do, and this image reflects this, is that it was an organizing effort as much as it was an art piece. So what I did was I built this big installation dealing with the issue of police brutality, but a big significant part of it was organizing the press conferences and the rallies and stuff that the installation was a backdrop for. And you know, and you'll notice as I go through my slide presentation too, I'm not so much into the formal aspects of documenting work. I have no documentation of this stuff other than what was in kind of in newspapers and stuff like that. So you'll see how that kind of plays itself out in the rest of this presentation. So I went from doing that kind of political work where, and many of you, if you've heard me speak before, I always like to tell the story of how that transition happened for me, going from utilizing traditional media to working in community environments. When I was doing those kind of political installations, organizing rallies and that kind of stuff, I actually had a break in the time in which I was to do another one, and I had a group of students from a high school to visit my studio, and there was a student there that was admiring the work, but he came back before they left and he said, well, you know, Mr. Lowe, while your work reflects what's going on in our communities, it's not what we need. We don't need people telling us what the issues are. We know. We live with it every day. And if you're an artist, why can't you create some kind of solution? And so that was the thing that kind of flipped everything for me. I mean, it challenged me. It challenged me to think about my creativity, how I apply it, and the way that it reaches the population that I was interested in. And so it was during that time that I shut down my studio and decided that I would figure out how I could utilize my creativity, my artistic insight, into making something or doing something that was both, you know, poetic, symbolic, but at the same time had a practical application. And that's when I went and I digging around and I found Joseph Boy's mentioning of social sculpture, in which he defined as the way in which we shape and mold the world around us. And that became a point through which I could investigate in a way that departed from this other way of working. And so I started doing volunteer work at a local community center, and just trying to be a part of it, trying to figure out, you know, how do I utilize myself as an artist, or as a citizen that was interested in the issues as well. But really, I was concerned about my career as an artist. You know, how do I apply this? And one day, I went on a tour with this group of the neighborhood adjacent to it in the 3rd Ward, and we went past buildings like this all over, you know, and they were identifying places that were dangerous and that were eyesores in the community. And they basically said that this location where Project Row Houses started, they said it was the worst place in the entire neighborhood because of the location and the kind of things that were happening here. And while I agreed with them, at the same time I was looking at the work of this artist named John Biggers, who is an African-American artist in Houston, who did a lot of work around shotgun houses, shotgun communities. And at a certain point, it kind of occurred to me that maybe taking some of these little old houses that had lost their value and trying to recontextualize it might be an entry for me into engaging in something that was that, you know, I could call social sculpture, that was both had a symbolic kind of framework that I could work within, but also address some real practical issues. And I'm just going to go through a series of slides to show some of the development process here, which was, you know, constantly devising ways to generate opportunities and different ways of thinking about this neighborhood. So this was a show that we did called the Drive-By Exhibition, which was when we first cleaned up the site. Other strategies that we employed were things like, we call this the House Challenge, where we challenge different institutions to come in and take on the renovation of each house. There were 22 houses on this site. And then we knew that we wanted it to be a laboratory and artists to be at the center of it, so we set it up where we would have this visiting artist program where artists would do projects in, sometimes it fluctuates from 7 to 8 houses. And one of the things that the part of the symbolism of this project for me became the architecture, and that was all based in the language that John Biggers had generated around the significance of the shotgun house structure, which that's a whole nother conversation when you start talking about the architecture of the shotgun house. As the center part of this project, having artists to be involved, we wanted to find artists that would normally show in, galleries or museum institutions. We wanted to bring them within the context of this neighborhood to see if there could be some kind of benefit of that creative involvement within the neighborhood. And also, let me just go back for a second too and connect it a little bit to this John Biggers idea of shotgun communities. I've learned over time that I've been using his work as a pattern or as a kind of a roadmap to understanding how to build this community. And I do that by exploring his work and trying to understand. Each time I see something that's of interest to me within the neighborhood, I always go back to his work and I look and I try to find out where did he talk about this in his work. So there are several things that I found that were interesting that John Biggers talks about that makes good neighborhoods. One of them is that you have to have good and relevant architecture, and that's where the symbolism of this project comes from, looking at the architecture of this neighborhood. The second thing is art and creativity and culture is a very important part. Third thing is education. Fourth, a social safety net. And the fifth one is economic sustainability. And so just kind of reclaiming the houses as they were was our exploration and investment into the architecture. But then the art and creativity, like I said, we wanted to bring in artists that could kind of teach us something or teach something to this community. And we've had a number of artists from all over. And I just, since I was speaking in Dallas City, I thought I would just focus on some of the Dallas people. This is Tracy Hicks, who was an early participant. Wait, did I pass? Oh, this is Vickery Meadow, who has worked with us on a number of occasions in different capacities. This is Barsamian, Bob Barsamian. Dave Herman, yeah. And Freddie McCoo worked on this project. And then, and people always bring us different ways of kind of thinking about how these houses can connect with people within the community. And some of them deal strictly with the architecture or with the structure, but some deal with the social issues, and some even more relevant to things that are specific to us. This is an artist who worked with us on building bridges between the artists and our transitional housing for young mothers, where they would have dinners together. This is another artist who did a piece to honor as a reception piece for evacuees from New Orleans right after Katrina. And this is also another artist that Vicki Meek brought us, who left us with a project that she called the Greenhouse Collaborative, in which they started to grow starter plants inside of the house, and they had this rack on the outside where people could actually, from the neighborhood, could come and take them and spread them out into their own gardens. And so I'm going through this fairly quickly because I want to get to some other things. So that's, as working with artists, we're always trying to find different ways that we can engage them in our process of where we are in whatever stage of development we are in the entire scope of what we're doing within the community. But equally as important is education, and we focus on young people. And in this particular program, where we work with children from the local schools in an after-school and summer education program. And this gives these students an opportunity to work with artists from all over the world to kind of engage in their creative processes. And then there are other places over time, and you'll see as I kind of go through some of the other stuff about the real estate issues that we've been able to acquire land throughout and trying to utilize that land in ways that bring some kind of aesthetic agenda or component to it in the process. And some of these, and the thing is about Project Throw Houses, it's a laboratory. So things that are existing now may not be there in 2 or 3 years. There are things that we cycle things in and out because it's all about trying to really tap into where the spirit and the energy of people within this community are at a particular time. And of course, acquiring vacant real estate, doing things like sculpture parks and gathering spaces, somewhat temporary uses for those, depending on other development opportunities. And then in terms of social safety net, there is, we decided to put together a housing program, and that housing program addressed housing for single mothers within our neighborhood. And the thing about this housing program, what we really wanted to do with it was to figure out how you could address symbolically what the possibilities are of dealing with or providing services for people who need housing. And so the first step of that was to kind of imagine these houses in a way that most people couldn't imagine, these little shotgun houses. And so kind of, renovating them and furnishing them in ways that you would see in other kind of housing types. But one of the things that's been really interesting about it, and often having artists engaged in the process is really cool, is that people challenge you. And we had an artist, Lonnie Graham, who's from Philadelphia, who basically was visiting us and got very close to the Young Mothers Program. And he kind of shifted our thinking around how we did this program, where the idea was we worked with professional designers and those kind of people to make the houses really, elevate the expectation of the houses for the mothers there. And Lonnie came back and said, though, but they're not benefiting from that. They're walking into something that they're kind of in awe of, but they're not really benefiting. So he challenged us to connect them to designers and have them design their own house, or help them understand how you make a place for yourself, so that they can carry that along with them beyond our program. And this is just an image I always like to show of some of our young mothers. The woman in the foreground here represents, to me, one of the most successful. If I never be able to achieve this again, I think working with her was, one incredible journey. She's a woman who was very, very troubled when we started this program, and she went through it and took everything that we had to offer, left that program, went on and got her PhD at Penn State, taught at University of Pittsburgh for a few years, and set up a research institute in which she wasn't beholden to the university. So she moved back to Houston, and now she's on our staff. So it's been really great to see someone like that go from being very, very low to just, going beyond anybody's imagination. So what we started to realize that we were, that we've been building a little community, but at the same time as we're building this community, there's this notion, your successes may, bring you a little bit of trouble, and it brought attention to this area as an area that was good for development, and so you start having these large townhouses popping up, taking over where these little smaller shotgun houses were, and you can kind of see why that's happening because of the context of the project, which is here. Downtown has been growing to the southeast, and the museum district, in kind of with the Texas Medical Center here, have been kind of pushing inward. And the universities, University of Houston and Texas Southern University, have all wanted to push inward as well. So we had a challenge to figure out how we would deal with that. And so what we did was we decided that instead of sitting back, and complaining about gentrification, that we would position ourselves to be contributors in the development of this neighborhood, and start buying land. Developed a partnership with Rice University School of Architecture to be able to look at the architecture and keep that as a component of everything that we do in this neighborhood, that the architecture is the foundation. So we have to pay close attention to that. And so we've gone on to develop additional housing types that are kind of spread throughout the neighborhood. And a combination, it's very important, a combination of building new houses like this one here, but also moving older houses into the neighborhood, and also honoring traditional things that happen in the neighborhood. This is a folk artist named the Flower Man who was in another part of the neighborhood that was having some trouble, and we ended up getting a house and helping him establish himself in our neighborhood. As well as we've been taking little small commercial buildings and trying to figure out ways to reintegrate them into our community. This is an old ballroom that we actually use the upstairs for, there's an upstairs ballroom space that we use for events. And the downstairs spaces we're using as little laboratories that working with artists, kind of incubating them on projects that they're working on. Just to give you a little scope of the neighborhood, Project Row Houses started out here with these 22 houses, and over the last 16 years we've expanded to, we own this entire area with the exception of about 3 properties here. This area, and then there's some scattered areas throughout. And we've actually expanded outside of this 35-block area. But the reason we did this 35-block area was an organizing strategy. A lot of this work is about strategic organizing and trying to get partners and people to understand the concept that we're trying to do to help us kind of move it forward. That's just a little bit about, you know, the impact of the project is, you know, seeing that, you know, we're really kind of building a place that is both social and private, in which, you know, there are public openings and activities that happen. There are smaller kind of community gatherings that are mostly just the people within our small community. And then there are just, you know, the private housing. And we have to keep a sense of, we have to keep a balance there of those kinds of things. And, but one of the interesting things to me about the impact that we've been having that's been really interesting for me has been to see that how other people have kind of gravitated toward the idea and have started to kind of do the same thing that we're doing, which is that's the best case scenario for us. If we can get other people to invest in this in the same way. So this is a private investor who took a group of little houses and renovated his, and then going back to the Flower Man, seeing how the impact of things can have ripple effects. You know, even the Flower Man, once we got him set up, you know, you could start seeing other people kind of play around with their houses and adding little bits and pieces of things. And yeah, so it's, you know, it's been a real interesting journey Project Row Houses has, and I'll go back to some other little things I'm kind of doing with Project Row Houses in a little bit. But this is a project that I said I would mention, which Stephen actually mentioned about the project in New Orleans. And of course, I left home and forgot the books. This is a little publication that we produced to kind of sum up our activities in New Orleans after 4 years of activity. We started out with this project to, we wanted to spend 3 years in New Orleans exploring the possibilities of what impact artists could have on dealing with urban issues. And we were fortunate to, you know, get a little pool of money, and we were also fortunate that we didn't position ourselves that we thought we had to be ongoing. So we were able to just do what we set out to do, close shop, and let it sit. And what's going to be really interesting for us is to go back and look at this project in, you know, 5 or 10 years and see what kinds of things have happened, have sustained themselves. I mean, Mel Chen's project is moving very well. Home NOLA is moving very well. There's a Sankofa Market in the Lower Ninth Ward is moving well. It'll be interesting to see how those things that we kind of plugged ourselves into will play itself out, you know, down the line. And yeah, and as was mentioned, this is a project that I worked in collaboration with Sam Durant and Jessica Cusick, who's a public art specialist, and Robert Ruella, who's an artist who was living in New Orleans, who actually invited me to come and explore. Now, now I'm gonna shift a little bit and talk about another project that I've been working on in Amherst with a group of students at Amherst College, and Wendy Ewall, who is a photographer, and she's a visiting artist at Amherst. And she actually, Wendy and I had been talking for a long time about working together since we met when I was working on the Delray Beach project in Florida. And so I decided I would explore this with her through her class at Amherst College. And so it was a very interesting process for me, because what I did was she asked, what do you think would be a key thing for students to learn in a kind of public practice class environment? And the thing that became, that I thought of, which I know is most important for me, doing socially engaged work or public practice work, is you've got to be able to listen. You've got to be able to listen smartly. You've got to be very, open to the possibilities. And so we arranged the first class around the idea of listening. And the students, for one semester, they just went out throughout the area and just devised ways to listen to people and find out what was interesting going on. And one of the things that came back from one of the students at the end of the semester that we thought we would pick up on was this idea of time bank. There was they have quite a few of them in the Northeast where, this idea of it's non-monetary transactions where someone may mow someone's yard and that gives them 1 hour in the time bank, and they could go look in the time bank and maybe they could get a haircut or something like that kind of thing. And so as Wendy and I started to push and explore that further, the thing we found out was that it's really the system of that didn't quite work, because 1 hour didn't necessarily equal 1 hour in general. So we had to figure out another way to approach it, and what we thought was interesting was not so much the idea of to document the trade, but just to see the trade happen and to encourage that kind of non-monetary exchange activities. And one of the things that helped us along the way on this was an economics professor at UMass who Julie Graham is her name, and she basically described herself as a feminist Marxist, but had come to the conclusion that the ideas and things that she was thinking in the 60s and 70s are far away now. So she thought, well, maybe I need to re-look at it and look at capitalism and socialism both as in a more critical way. And so what she started doing was trying to diffuse the idea of the purity of either capitalism or socialism. And so this is her model of the production of the United States as a capitalist society, because most people think of it as a market-driven economy, it's private property and so on and so forth. But her thing was that a big part of the market, in fact, she says probably less than 50% is commodity-driven, because there's a huge chunk that's government. But then there's that other part which you can really just call it the informal economy, of where people trade and do all kinds of things, and money never exchange hands. So we were very interested in that, and so we started this project called the Exchange Value Project. First, the first step of it was a newsletter. And we framed this newsletter around the idea of kind of a business page. We wanted to kind of elevate this idea of non-monetary exchanges on the level of those of traditional kind of economic exchanges. But we fill the pages with stories of people talking about their experience with exchanges, why they do it, what's important, and what makes it how it helped them sustain their lives. And so we started the production of this, and then we decided, as we were moving this along, that we would open our own little bank. And we managed to get the university to give us a space that we could actually kind of design our own little bank and design our banking approach. This is our little lobby here, and basically, as the newsletter is produced, we always just kind of we started framing and doing the news pages in a way that we could give them to the people. And the way that we organized it too, though, was in relation to a couple of different communities. There was this student community on campus, but there was also a senior citizen housing project with about 400 people nearby. And there was the university that had a hard time trying to make a bridge between those two. And so we thought maybe we could see if we could generate some exchange between those different groups. And we've been trying to keep a membership of about 50 so that we can kind of monitor those. This is this fall would be our third semester on this. This semester we're going to try to digitize things and get things online so we can kind of better track and maybe even pick up new members of the banking system. And also, but the bank also has become a place of just kind of where people gather and talk about different activities. So this is actually the little satellite bank in the senior center, so they don't have to make it all the way across the town to the university to make their deposits. But one of the most interesting things though about this project though has been watching and seeing those students and the seniors come together at these. Sometimes they're breakfasts, sometimes lunches, teas, and those kinds of things, where they get together and they talk about, what are the issues that are facing them that bond them together within this kind of, or set the possibilities for this trading process. It's been very, very interesting. But one of the things that was really interesting for us to find was how hard it is to get people to think about their engagement in non-monetary exchanges. We just don't think about how we do that. So if you ask people, what things do you think you would give to people next week, or what things you might need, it's hard for them to think of it. But if you ask them to just think hard about what they received last week that they didn't pay for, or what did they give to someone like, then it becomes really clear. And so these two little graphs here, this is the one that looks backward, where people are looking back at what they would give and what they would receive. And then this is the one looking forward of what they would give and what they receive. People always project that they're going to give less or need less, but when you go backward and you look, it's always that they actually gave more and used more. And it's also been interesting to see how, some of the people, there's one, a man at the senior housing center who says that he drives people. He has a car. He sits around at breakfast in the morning time, and somebody needs a ride. He'll give them a ride. But he said he'll do it maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And once he joined this banking system, other people started seeing that he was depositing, that he would give rides. And all of a sudden, his whole life, he has this kind of social life of just driving people around now. It's just added this whole nother level of excitement for him to within his community. And so we're trying to test this idea that if we could raise the awareness of people about the kinds of contributions that they make, maybe it would elevate that, and we could kind of use that in a way of helping people sustain themselves in kind of tough times. But also, it's about kind of building community and connecting with people as well. So that project, I started kind of getting into this whole thing about, economic structures and those kinds of things, which I don't know anything about, but it's always an opportunity to learn for me and to collaborate with people and work and do different things. But what I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I got to the point where I was involved in so many projects that were, just so many collaborators, and it was so much stuff going on, and I just couldn't find myself, in these projects. Just get lost in them, and I think that's the most important thing in terms of these kind of large collaborative projects. It is important to get lost, but at the same time, sometimes you want to kind of place yourself in it in a different way. And so I started to look around the Third Ward neighborhood and try to find some things that I could do that could be more personal. And so I started out with this guy who is his name is Eugene Howard, but he calls himself brother-in-law. And he's an interesting guy because he came to Project Row Houses in the late 90s as someone who had been in prison for 20-something years and didn't know, no education, no job opportunities or whatever, and somebody who was working on our staff who also had come to us from, had been incarcerated. And this guy told Eugene, said, if you don't want to go back to jail, you should just hang out around this neighborhood, hang out around these people. They're always doing positive stuff, so you'll find something that'll work for you. And so as he was hanging out all the time, one of the things I started noticing was how, he was just so generous and always smiling and really had nothing. And so I started giving him a few dollars here and there to do things. And then I noticed that every time I would do that, he would always come back with big plates of barbecue, and start saying, just feeding people. And I was talking to him one day, and I start to see him as kind of almost like those shotgun houses were when we first saw them. They were just broken, no attention. There was just no one had looked at the possibilities of these houses. And I thought, what if I just try to look at the possibility of this guy? And so I started talking to him about what it was that he dreamed of and what would be interesting for him. And he started talking about how he's always dreaming if he could have a barbecue place and all this stuff. And so I just thought, as an idea of helping him dream, I would just kind of do something with him. And so we set out to, I kind of call these little portraits. I just did this little portrait of him in a way that he that he sees himself as a possibility. And I did it as something that was a way of just showing him in a different way, but also as kind of an organizing strategy for Project Row Houses in our community, because there are things that we don't have in our neighborhood, which are, we don't have any kind of retail, we don't have any kind of stores or restaurants and that kind of stuff. And so, this idea of him having a little restaurant is an idea that would benefit Project Row Houses as well. And so this is something that started, that has continued along, and it's kind of moved some of Project Row Houses programming into the direction of food activities. And whether we'll end up with a real brother-in-law's restaurant, I don't know. But at least he's played his part, in kind of helping his community think about itself as it moves into the future. And plus, I'm making these T-shirts and coffee mugs and that kind of stuff. So, and he gets all the proceeds from that. So, this is another person in the neighborhood that there's four of them that I'm going to show you today. But this is another person. This guy in the foreground here, his name is Kenya Shabazz. He's kind of a one-person. He was kind of a one-person Black Panther party, and then he picked up another person, and most people in the neighborhood kind of thought of him as this kind of crazy guy, and nobody people talked about him in weird ways. But the other thing I noticed though was how every day between the hours of 2:30 and 4:30, he's at like this little convenience store watching to make sure the children are safe, because in these little convenience stores sometimes actually once there was a kid that almost got shot for taking a piece of candy or something, and so he's there, he plants himself there to kind of take care of the children and that, and he patrols the neighborhood and stuff. And so I started to think about him, and so I did this little campaign of him called The Power of Peace, and I started putting them all over the neighborhood. And it was very interesting how, as these things start kind of floating around, all of a sudden he had an identity in the neighborhood that was associated with something that kind of, with Project Row House, that it legitimized him in a way in which he was, it just lifted his spirits incredibly and changed the relationship between he and the people in the community, and also allowed him to build more. So now he is, he's a Black Panther of about 15, which has been really, really great for us because they literally do patrol the streets, and it's something that we definitely need. And this is another one, woman. Her name is Cookie Love. And they have these strange names. I don't know why. I mean, I'm not making these names up, but this is her name, Cookie Love. I used to see this woman walk through the neighborhood all the time, pushing this grocery cart with big black bags in the cart, and didn't pay much attention to her. And she also had this big chain around her neck too. I thought it was kind of odd, but one day I was doing something, and I was doing laundry and went to the laundromat, put my clothes in the wash, and then something came up, and I knew I was not going to have enough time to go back and put them in the dryer and all. So I saw this woman, and I said, hey, could I leave you some money, and you put my wash in the dryer, and I'll be back to get it. And she goes, yeah, sure, I'll do that. So when I came back, it was all nicely folded and everything, and I was like, oh, you didn't have to do that. And she was like, oh, no, I like doing that. That's what I do. I try to make a little extra money. I was like, really? So then I started talking to her about it, and so I ended up, just kind of using her all the time as the person that I would just take my laundry and drop it off. But then she came up missing, and I couldn't find her. And so I was asking everybody. And then one day I saw her and said, what happened, Cookie? And she said, well, this is the 4th laundromat that I've been kicked out of. People think that I'm, stealing their business or whatever. And she didn't have a place to wash her clothes. She didn't have a place to do laundry. So one of the things that Project Row House has been doing, we've grown from, the 7 initial young women that live in our neighborhood to some 43 households, and none of those households have washer and dryer connections. And we did that specifically thinking that at some point we'd have a laundry facility. And so Cookie gave the opportunity to kind of brand our laundry facility in a way that kind of pays homage to some of the people within the neighborhood. And then finally, this one didn't really, I haven't been able to figure out how to structure this in anything except that Benjamin is a neighborhood guy who walks and plays this music all the time, and he kind of sees himself as a mystic man. And one of the things that happened was there were a lot of fires in the neighborhood at one point, houses burning down, and he would always be there playing his horn. And so a couple of times I was able to catch him and to just kind of create this piece around him and, kind of making little flyers of that, putting them in the public realms to give people a different way of looking at this guy. So now I'm going to finish up with a project that I've been working on. This project is really killing me. It's because of the way that I work. Generally, it's all about the relationships that you build with people. I mean, it's about nothing if it's not about the relationships. And working in a place where you don't speak the language, the culture is very, very different. It's just been almost impossible. And so I've been working on this project since July of last year. I've been going every month since March, but one of the things that's interesting about it though is that when I went there a year ago, I had an idea of what gentrification was, and to me this was kind of it. I was breathing this kind of activity in the 3rd Ward in Houston. But when I got to Anyang, it was interesting how there's this neighborhood here. It goes further down. It's about 35 blocks. And most of the buildings in here, anywhere from 3 to 5 story buildings. Last year, July, it was a thriving neighborhood with folks all over the place, businesses downstairs, people living upstairs. And what we were told at this initial gathering was that in 5 years, this neighborhood would become this. And it was a weird thing, I just couldn't quite understand, what do you mean in 5 years, you're gonna, that's just gonna flip like that. And it was, let me also go back a little bit too. This project came about because of an architect named Keon Park, who started the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. And Keon is Korean. He was invited to this little town called Anyang to direct their biannual public art program. And the Anyang public art program was put together by the mayor of Anyang as a way of kind of bringing the arts to this little town. So they started, this is the third one. The first one they did, they used kind of a more traditional public art model where they were uncovering a creek through a neighborhood, and they had all these artists who build bridges and benches and do things on sidewalks and all that, the traditional kind of public art work. And then the next time they built one of these things they call new towns, where it's just basically a whole new neighborhood and had a big park in the center. And they had a director of the program who went out and just, who curated sculpture for the park, and wonderful work. I mean, from Vito Conci to Oldenburg, Ritger Tervanigi. I mean, just loads of people from all over. And but then for this public art program, they decided to do something different because they were about to do a series of these kind of developments. And for the first time, they had people resisting or complaining. And the mayor didn't understand why. And so someone suggested to him that maybe they should use this public art program to explore, what kinds of things are happening within their development approach. And so they contacted Keon because Keon does a lot of work about the theory of cities and development and growth and that kind of stuff. And so as we're all there, a group of us from all over the world, kind of exploring the city and trying to understand it, we're walking through the markets in this neighborhood and seeing, the little small businesses and how people are operating, and talking to them though about, what do you think about this idea that, in 5 years, this is going to be a different place, and what are you going to do? How are you going to adjust yourself? And most of the attention among the group that I was with there at the time was on the displacement of people's homes, of where they were going to live. But what was interesting to me, though, was not so much, I was concerned about, housing, but to me, housing is, you can handle housing if you have income, if you have a way to, economically sustain yourself. But if you don't have your housing and you don't have a way to earn a living, then it's like, that's double whammy, And then to me, the business part becomes even, the toughest part. And so this is a group strategizing here with the mayor. This was the mayor who had invited us. And I don't know if anybody here reads Korean, but I was told that this sign here is one of the protest signs of, against the mayor for his development approach that was happening in this area. So what I ended up doing was coming up with this idea about how small businesses could be in the balance of big change. It could be in the balance of big change in terms of how you preserve culture, or it could be in the balance of big change of how you learn to develop and grow your city. And so I was teamed up with a couple of universities. I actually asked for resources from the universities, both an art school and a business school. And the faculty members that went along with that. And so we started to explore these businesses and look at, how they operate and what are the issues they're facing and what are the possibilities, what's of helping them. Well, one of the things that I found was that was enlightening for me, in which I've been able to bring it back to my work in other places, is this idea of what happens. Why is it that these small businesses are under attack? Why do they feel so disempowered? And it came to me this idea of innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship is kind of lacking in these places where people are complaining. I started to reflect back on this idea that if we had started with if I had entered into the community dialogue with Project Row Houses, taking a complaining stance that you shouldn't be developing in this neighborhood, you shouldn't be tearing down houses or whatever, I would have had nothing to stand on. It was only that we offered some kind of different opportunity there. And so I started thinking about how do you get people to think about the importance of creativity and how do you encourage that. And so with this group of students, we developed a small business competition as a way of kind of organizing people and getting them to think about themselves in terms of how could they see themselves presenting themselves other business opportunities within the growth of the city. And this is we went out and we worked with hundreds of businesses all over. There's lots of people in the competition, but then we narrowed it down to a small group in which we ended up with a little tofu shop that that's our winning group. And what I ended up doing though was taking my budget and taking 35% of my budget as the cash award for the businesses, as a way of kind of really not just talking about it, but giving them some resources for us to put a team together around to help usher them into a new life and existence. And this guy is, one of the things that was interesting about him was that he knew that with this new development that people were, the kinds of people that were moving in would be interested in, organic kinds of foods. And so he's developing his process for doing organic tofu. And that's been a real interesting thing for me, to kind of be involved in that process and see how these businesses are responding. Which the other thing though is really interesting though is I don't understand a lot of what's going on, so I have to kind of which has been really interesting for me too though, because it's also it helps me understand better the importance sometimes of disappearing in the process. And I found very quickly that in many of these meetings with the business people, it just made no sense for me to be there to try to articulate something and have a translator translate it and so on and so forth. And sometimes the cultural difference. I mean, there were people that just weren't ready to listen to me as a foreigner, kind of talking to them about what they should be doing. So it was so much. I learned so much about this idea of investing in the team, and getting my team members in a position that they could go and kind of and articulate the things that needed to be talked about. And then there's another part of this whole thing that was occurring to me in this process too, that had to do much more with the kind of aesthetics and social aspects of what was happening with this new development. One was the aesthetics of the streets. When you see most of these down the streets of this little town, every building, you don't see the architecture. The architecture is the signs. That becomes the identity of the place. It becomes the aesthetics, of a place. And so what they end up doing when they take out these neighborhoods and replace them with these new high-rises, they also bring in big box retail. And so what you have, instead of a building like this that may have, 30, 40 businesses in it, all of a sudden you'll have one. This thing is called E-Mart, which is equivalent to our Walmart. And so you wipe this away, you'll end up with just one sign, which is a different kind of aesthetic, for this community than what they were accustomed to. So I started to kind of play around with this with doing these workshops with people, in kind of in the little, in some of the businesses, but mostly neighborhood youth, on this idea of what happens to the aesthetics if you block out, all the signs. What happens? What does it look like? Or what happens if you take away the building, then you only have the signs. Which one is a better locator of the place? Which one speaks more to the aesthetics? And then even like what would happen if you just take out the entire thing? And so as they're doing this as an exercise to kind of think about this stuff, and it also just kind of got me interested just in kind of just because not knowing what the signs are saying and what's what I'm reading, I'm just looking at shapes, and so I started just kind of exploring more of just the shapes and dynamics of space on these particular buildings. And so finally, there is an exhibition that fits within this project. But let me also say, though, the exhibition is only a strategy in which will allow the further exploration of this idea of small business, big change. How do we continue to work with these small businesses in a way that could possibly, the big goal is to have the city actually adopt this competition process and make it an annual thing in which they can reach a lot more businesses than we can, and work with them with the intent, along with developers, in looking at those businesses, their new plans, and figuring out how they could funnel into the possible new developments that are going on. But this is this little piece. There's a group, an architecture group called Ramlabar, who designed the exhibition frame, and so this is our little temporary small business center in which all of our finalists businesses will have the new signs that the students are doing on the exterior, and interior will be their comments and things about their experiences and their challenges, and the things that they like, the benefits of being in small business. And then inside the little house here is our homage to the winner of the competition. And so I'm going to stop there, but just to close by saying that I have learned over time that that for me, this idea of social sculpture, in the way that Joseph Beuys talks about it, as the way in which we shape and mold the world around us. And he also said that everybody was an artist. And I think that he was being, kind of idealistic about that. But I think that's something that, as an artist working within this kind of social sphere, there's a great possibility of entering into conversations about the built environment that artists can have, such a huge, impact. Because the one thing is that, and people always ask me, well, what's the difference between you doing it and some other, person, like oftentimes housing. They say, what's the difference between you doing housing and a housing developer doing housing? Well, to me, generally, housing developers are doing houses to put people in. When I'm interested in housing in terms of what it can teach us, what we can learn, what questions can we ask, how can we utilize that housing process to explore things that would have impacts that has nothing necessarily to do with housing. Housing becomes the vehicle through which you explore. And yeah, so to me, social sculpture is something that has a huge place to grow in our future. Thank you. Any questions? No? Yes.
Where did you get funding to do PRH, and how did you get compensated on the social projects?
Funding for Project Row Houses has, it started out, it was, we had a $25,000 commitment from the National Endowment for the Arts that allowed us to raise, a small amount of money. And, but, what I always like to think about about the projects that I'm interested in. It's not so much about money. It's about resources. It's about trying to figure out what resources are available in a given context. So really more important than money in the beginning of Project Row Houses was a dedicated group of people that were willing to give their time. I mean, we worked on that project for, I guess, about a year before we had any money. I mean, it was basically just people showing up, bringing their energy as a resource. And some of it meant physical labor, but some of it meant connections to other resources that were available. And so I like to always start from a resource standpoint as opposed to a money standpoint. And I see it so often that when people have this idea that they start out with a kind of a budget line, and they're trying to reach that budget line to get the project going, it just never happens. Yes.
In Anyang, I'm real curious. You showed us a picture of a neighborhood with maybe two or three story businesses and maybe homes. It's hard to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And then you showed 5 years later that neighborhood was full of high rises.
Mm-hmm.
How will that community possibly resist the development of those high rises? And then where do your ideas fit into those high rises?
Yeah. Well, first of all, they don't stand a chance. I mean, that's for certain. When I was there last year, as I said, it was a vibrant neighborhood. This year, they've already, it's probably, I don't know, maybe 80% of people are gone. And so I'm assuming, according to their schedule, by, spring or so, they'll start, the demolition and start rebuilding. Originally, when I started the project, I was so attached to that particular place, and I wanted to do something to try to engage people in that place. But I realized that was so far gone, and it was going so fast that there was nothing that any of us could do to deal with that. So I had to step back and think of it in a little bit broader sense, because that's not an isolated situation. I mean, there are a number of those kind of developments that are happening all over. And so the idea of doing this thing, Small Business Big Change, was to look at the entire city and to draw upon the business community, small business community of the entire city, and not just focus on any particular neighborhood. Because, in fact, the little tofu shop that's our winner is actually in a neighborhood that's probably fairly secure at this point. So, we're not saving him from imminent, displacement. However, what we're doing, though, hopefully, is that, if we can get his business in a way, position it to move it toward integrating into one of the new developments, it'll become a model, or at least influence the thinking about, how they proceed when they start to approach these developments. Yes. I think socially engaged work as a field of interest in the arts has a huge challenge, and it is about how we talk about it, how we're critical of it. I mean, there's just no platform through which that happens. The language doesn't necessarily exist, to do that. And another big part of it is, the impact. I mean, how do you measure that impact? I think of situations like the Watts House project that I started through exhibition at MoCA years ago. I started that project and gave it a framework through which I thought would move it along in dealing with the issues around the Watts Towers, right? And I expended all the resources that I could on that project over about a 3.5, 4-year period. And at a certain point, I just thought I couldn't do it any longer. However, there was a young artist who was assisting me at the time. He was in undergraduate school, named Edgar Arsenault, who I tried to mentor him along and keep him going. And and I guess in the early, like around 2001, 2002, as his career started to grow, he became more interested in engaging with the Watts House Project. And so now, I mean, he's become a superstar in LA with the Watts House Project because he's been very good in terms of how he's been able to conceptualize and reframe that project and move it forward. And so if someone had asked me, the success or failure of that project, on the one hand, you could say, well, it was a failure because it didn't achieve the things that I had set out to do. However, if you look at it on the other hand, though, that the project in its framework was significant enough that it attached itself to another artist that allowed that artist to kind of keep moving that agenda forward, then there may be some reason to look at it in a way of being successful. So it's kind of hard to look at these socially engaged projects and define success, because when you start talking about success, you're trying to box it, in a given time frame. And for many of them, it's not about putting it in a given time. It's a living organism that will continue to grow and have experiences. There's been times I thought that Project Row Houses was, had huge impact. And there are other times when I thought, it's just kind of moving along, and then there are new opportunities and things that the impact changes. So, I'm sorry I can't quite answer your question, because it's something that it's a very complicated thing that I don't think we're prepared to understand that, because you can't measure the impact in the same way that people measure the number of units of housing that you put on the ground. I mean, there's a group called Local Initiative Support Corporation that was put together to deal with community development corporations years ago. And they took the easy way out in terms of trying to understand the impact they were having. Because they went to this approach to community development to say, we're going to get as many units on the ground as possible. Well, you can measure that. You can talk about the impact of that on some level. But what they realize, down the line now is that, that's not really community development. I mean, that's just putting units on the ground. So what's the impact it's really having on building community? And they don't know. So now they're trying to restructure their way of approaching it. Yes.
Can we just shift the question for just a moment and say, could you or would you say that you can define the impact of your projects through different means? In other words, do the participants or the members of the community, can they give testimonials about the value of those projects so that there is a definable body of information that talks about impact without necessarily quantifying?
Yeah, I think we kind of came to that conclusion with Transformer projects. And by the way, if anybody's interested in that book, you can email me and I'll get your copy. But also, you can get it on the Transformer Project's website. You can it's on PDF in PDF form there. But the thing that we came to the conclusion when we started to do that publication was that we couldn't look at it from a single perspective. So there are three basic components to that little publication. And one is a document written by Amy Chang, who is she's the director of education, I think, at the Blanton. She was at the Hammer Museum, and she does it from an arts perspective. And then there is Maria Jackson, who is an urban planner, who looks at it from that perspective. And then Tom Finkelpearl, who's at the Queens Museum, actually he does a more interview style, to look at the artists that were engaged in the process. And so, yeah, you can't just kind of put you can't just neatly say, this was the impact, because it has many different directions. Anybody else? Thank you.